Good morning. One of my favorite shows on, I guess you could say, to be quite honest, even books, is actually a book written by a guy by the name of Alexander Dumas. He actually was the same man who wrote The Three Musketeers. So if you're familiar with The Three Musketeers, The Man in the Iron Mask, he was the one who was behind a lot of those stories. And my favorite show or book or movie has actually been, through much of my life, The Count of Monte Cristo. If you're familiar with the story, you know it fairly well. Now, there's something a little strange about this story to me, and that is this. I grew up, and the two main versions of this movie that I'm familiar with, in the end of the movie, The Count of Monte Cristo gets the girl. That's the story that I knew. I found out about 2 weeks ago that's not the real story. About 2 weeks ago, my life changed when I discovered that the Count of Monte Cristo is not actually a good ending. And it's one of those things where it really shocked me because I know for a fact that the movies that I had seen, the ones I'm most familiar with was one I had, I believe it's Antonio Banderas as the Count of Monte Cristo. And it's another one from the 1930s that I had most familiarity with. And the other day I watched one from the 1970s. And whenever I got to the ending, I'm thinking that it's going to have the good, happy ending. And no, it didn't have the good, happy ending. And I was shook, and I was startled, and it turned into a bad day pretty quickly. So I had to look it up. I never read the book, so I had to look it up and see what the actual real ending was. And it has a sad ending. What happens is, in The Count of Monte Cristo, if you're not real familiar with the story, he is basically this man, and he is on a ship. And he lands in harbor, and he became the captain of the ship, acting captain, because the captain had died. Before the captain had died, he gave him a letter and said, take this on to so-and-so, and basically he tries to. Lo and behold, he gets thrown in jail. He's literally one day away from marrying his sweetheart. He spends the next 10 years in prison figuring out who set him up and why they did it. Whenever he finally gets out, he discovers a huge cache of wealth, and he basically goes about a spree of rampaging revenge. And that's kind of the story. And in the end, the stories I was always familiar with always had him finally getting back together with the woman he was supposed to marry. But that wasn't the case. The thing is, though, it's a sad ending. And sad endings happen. The thing that we're going to talk about today biblically, though, is this. What is apocalyptic literature? That's kind of a hard shift from Count of Monte Cristo to apocalyptic literature. Yeah. Apocalyptic literature, a lot of people look at, like your books of Revelation, the books of Daniel, the book of Isaiah. A lot of people look at these books and they think to themselves, it's some kind of secret telling of future events. That could be part of it, but what if I told you there's something even better than that there? And that's what we're going to talk about today. If you have your Bibles, we're going to be in the book of Revelation, chapter 21. Revelation, chapter 21. Now, as you're turning there, just so you are aware, the book of Revelation is a very, very unique book, obviously. It is the only book in the New Testament that is considered apocalyptic literature. And the point of apocalyptic literature will become very, very clear as soon as we begin reading. A lot of people focus on the destruction, the chaos, and all of that. But that's actually not the point of the story. The point of the story comes at the end. It's kind of like the reverse of Monte Cristo, where you have kind of a rough ending, and this one, you have a little bit of a different ending. So the book of Revelation, chapter 21, it says, Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. We will stop right there. The problem with the book of Revelation is a lot of people want to look at it and try to pick out things that they see in the news around them. The truth is, if you go back in time, you go back to the 400s whenever Rome was being sacked and destroyed by barbarians. They would have looked at this and tried to look at the news around them. In the 1200s, when the Byzantine Empire was being collapsed upon by the Seljuk Turks, they would have once again been looking at this and identifying with the surroundings. Today, we can definitely identify with the surroundings. And it's one of those things that's kind of been a historical theme about this book. The truth about prophecy is this: it's twofold. In the Old Testament, you have got the Messiah is coming. Whenever Christ does come, he is crucified and born again. But what you also find, though, is that now we know as Christians he is coming again. And so there is this twofold nature of prophecy. But there's another thing of importance. There are small details within the book of Revelation that are actually about the time period John was writing. For instance, there's a section where it talks about the angels at the heads of the Euphrates and Mesopotamian rivers. That's where the armies that destroyed the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD were actually stationed at. That's where they were. And there's a lot of other things that kind of tie into his historical time frame. But to kind of throw that all on its ear, something else a little more amazing about it is in one of the chapters it talks about this burning star coming from the sky and crashing into the ground and destroying, I believe it's a third of all living things. And the word is wormwood, which is bitterness. That translates as the word in Russian, Chernobyl. And many of us are probably familiar with what Chernobyl was. So there's a lot of things in this book that are very, very unique. Another thing, Gog and Magog, it talks about them. Once again, that's actually a reference to Russia, not far actually from Chernobyl, that same region. So there's a lot of things in this book. But the point of the book, that's not the point of the book. There may be little gems like that and things that you can actually take and apply to the world around you. But the real point of the book is what we find here in verse 21. And I'm going to read it again in verse 1. It says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Count of Monte Cristo does not have a happy ending. The book of Revelation does. That's the importance of apocalyptic literature. It has got a happy ending. And what you see in the world around is that despite all the evil, evil may have its hour. And I've seen this quote a lot recently. Evil may have its hour, but God has his day. And that's the simple truth. Evil may rampage as much as it wants, but it has still been defeated because everything is going to be new. Everything will be restored. When we talk about the idea of restoration of what was meant to be, what do we really mean? We're talking about the Garden of Eden. That's where we are in fact created to be. We're not to live on this earth that has been cursed, but instead we're supposed to be in communion with God in such a way that we could walk and commune with him daily, that we could actually have a friendship with him. That is where we were actually created for and where it is that we are to be. So when we talk about earth being created new, this new earth, this new heaven, this restoration of what was once ruined, it's about being united once more with God. And that's why it's so important where he says, God is with us. And the fact that he will wipe every tear from every eye. And there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order is gone. You read the book of Revelation, a lot of people get spooked. You get to the end of Revelation, it's very, very joyful. Evil may have its hour, but God has his day. Let's read on. Verse 5, it says, He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. He said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all this. And I will be their God, and they will be my children. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. Write it down. It's trustworthy. It's true. You can believe and have faith within it. And within him is the very beginning of all things, and he shall also be the very end of all things. He is our everything. And he also goes further to say that he gives freely to all who thirst, all who desire to come near him. He opens that door for them. He gives freely those who thirst. But for those who do not humble themselves before God, those who are suffering with an affliction of sin, but enjoy their sin too much, those who are prideful and boastful of sin, they will be judged. God, we have got this interesting concept of heaven and hell that we have in our minds. And I've been studying this for quite some time. We actually talked about it in one of our Bible studies one time. And basically, from what I can gather, your earliest Christians taught that heaven and hell is actually the same place. The difference and distinction is standing in the presence of a loving Father or standing in the presence of a God who is angry, who you never acknowledged, who you never bowed before. There is a big distinction there. I know for a fact as a little child, I remember one day I went swimming in a mud puddle. And I tell you the truth, I came back to the house, and as I came to the house, I saw the mud coming from the mud puddle with me. Mom stopped me at the door. Dad wasn't far behind. Dad wasn't happy. Neither was Mom. But what I can tell you is this. There was a very, very big difference between that and whenever I graduated high school or when I got married. My mother and my father, they loved it. They were enjoyed with everything that was going on. They were happy for me. They were proud of me. But the day I went swimming in that mud puddle out in the driveway, no, not happy whatsoever. There is a distinction. And I don't want to downplay what God's judgment is, but the reality is that He is an all-consuming fire, and He can either be a light to you and a guide, or He is a consuming fire. There is no in-between. So it's vital for us as Christians to recognize that there still is a right, there still is a wrong. Because if there wasn't, we wouldn't say evil has its hour. We would say evil doesn't exist. But we know evil exists, and God still calls it evil. Let's read on, verse 9. We'll read a big section. It says, one of the seven angels who had had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues came and said to me, come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, 12 angels at the gates. On the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, and 3 on the west. The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The angel who talked to me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city, its gates and its walls. The city was laid out like a square as long as it was wide. He measured the city with the rod and found it to be 12,000 stadia in length, and as wide and as high as it was long. The angel measured the wall using human measurements, and it was 144 cubits thick. The wall was made of jasper, and the city of pure gold, as pure as glass. The foundations of the city walls were decorated with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth ruby, the seventh chrysolite, eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th turquoise, the 11th jacinth, the 12th amethyst. The 12 gates were 12 pearls, each made of each single pearl. The great street of the city was gold, as pure and transparent. Verse 22. I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp. We will stop right there. Now, the reason why it's important to look at the description is there's a lot of significance about the various things and what they mean. But the most important thing is you've got a man measuring it out. This angel is measuring it out. You don't measure things that don't exist. You don't measure things that don't exist. And that means an important thing for us. It's real. It's not imaginary, it's real. It's not something a fairy tale is told to make people feel better. It is a real place. And that's why he is laying out and measuring it. And he's describing and telling you about it. If I was to make up in my head a fish aquarium at my house, and I tried to describe it to you, you would notice something pretty quickly. First off, I don't have one, because I'd be telling you about the size, and I'd say, well, it's about yay by yay. You know, most people who have a fish aquarium will remember, oh, it's really measured by gallons. It's a 10-gallon tank, or it's a this size tank. And then they'll tell you if it's a freshwater or saltwater tank, what kind of fish they have. I'd have to sit here and make up half of it, and you'd catch me stammering before too long. Now, I could describe an old fish tank we had years ago, but you can tell the difference. The difference is this is a real thing. I had a good friend of mine whenever we were growing up. He was one of those kids that always liked to kind of brag and tell stories to make him kind of seem a little more important. And you could always tell, because anytime he started to kind of tell these little stories, and everybody knew it, we just kind of accepted it. It's just who he was. It is what it is. Kids do things. And what we noticed, though, is whenever he started to tell stories, he'd start to wander into a story a little more. He'd start adding to it more and more. And next thing you know, he's describing a pair of shoes that's 24 karat gold. And we're like, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but we'll go along with it. Whatever you say, friend. We can figure it out. The thing is God's describing this intentionally and directly because it is a real place. But there's one other thing that's of great significance to me and why I read verse 22 and 23. Verse 23 again says, the city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives its light, and the Lamb is its lamp. The Lamb, Christ, is its lamp. Now, what's this mean? Well, the lamp, obviously, we picture a lamp. It is the enclosure around a light. Sometimes it's up on a post. But the light itself is God. And if you look at all of Christ's ministry, what's he doing? The entire time he's pointing to God, much like a lamp is directing you toward the light. God is that light. Now, there's an interesting thing in the New Testament that takes place, and a lot of people don't always connect these things, but they are very, very significant. God is, in fact, light, the light of the world, of course, in the book of John as it opens. But also there's an interesting thing. During the Transfiguration, it talks about how the disciples could not see. They could barely see, and there was Christ himself standing in full glory. That is referenced as Mount Tabor's light. Mount Tabor's light is what they're talking about here. That same light that poured out on earth as Christ. And it's an amazing thing if you ever get the opportunity to read the Transfiguration stories and to go into detailed study about what it meant. It ties in directly into the book of Revelation. It ties also into Christ's resurrection and into his ascension into heaven itself. But all these things are vastly important. But the most important thing when you read a book like the book of Revelation, unlike the Count of Monte Cristo, it has a good ending. Every one of us, these are the key points as we remember this. So in conclusion, I want to remind you of these key things. In the new heaven and new earth, Christ walks with us. Everything is restored. God is with us. He will wipe every tear. It is all completed. It is finished. And there will be a new heaven, and He Himself will be our light. There's a quote I saw the other day I want to share with you. It says, "The steeper the mountain, the harder the climb, the better the view from the finish line." This has been a hard challenge, a hard life. In the words of the Apostle Paul, run that race for all it is. Run the good race, fight the good fight, and never give up the faith.